What's up, dear YouTube viewers? Time flies by fast. Half of the World Cup matches have already been played, and we are already to the round of 32. So today I want to go over my predictions for what will happen in the round of 32 and who will win every game, and what plans some teams will have to win the game. Now, of course, I'm not saying that my results will be 100% correct. In fact, when I was predicting the group stages, I have made some mistakes. For example, with Turkey and Uruguay. But at the same time, I also made some really good co-ops, such as that Mexico would top their group and that Ivory Coast would show off good results in all three of their matches. So, my predictions are just my opinion, and I really don't encourage you to use them to bet on any matches, but those are just what I think. And I could be wrong in some of them, but I also could be right in some of them. Okay, let's start with Mexico versus Ecuador. Now, Mexico easily finished top of their group and became the only team to finish with 9 points while at the same time not conceding a single goal. Not even Spain, not even Argentina, not even Brazil were able to get close to Mexico. Argentina was really close, but at the last moment they conceded to Jordan, which made Mexico the only team to finish with 9 points without conceding a single goal. Now, sure, we can talk about how easy of a group Mexico had, but I wouldn't say it was an easy piece of cake. All three of the other teams in the group had something to offer. South Korea had many players playing in European clubs such as Kim Min-jae and Lee Kwon-in. Czechia eliminated the Netherlands at the Euro 2021, and many of the players who were part of that team still are part of that team now. And South Africa finished third or fourth in, I can't remember exactly, in the AFCON of 2021. 2023. And many of the players who did it back then are still part of the South African team now. So I would not say that Mexico had a very easy group. Sure, it wasn't hard, but it also wasn't a piece of cake. And we can't underestimate what Mexico has achieved. Now, Ecuador, I already told you my opinion about them in one of my past videos. They have serious problems scoring goals. And the fact that they drew with Curacao proves this. Sure, at the last moment they defeated Germany, but Germany was already relaxed back then because they already guaranteed themselves first place. So I think Mexico is a clear favorite in this. I do think Mexico will struggle against Ecuador defense, but I also think that just nearly they will advance. I'm predicting a 1-0 victory in favor of Mexico, where they will struggle against Ecuador's defenders, but just at the last moment they will finally squeeze one goal and advance to the round of 16. Ecuador could potentially advance further in 4 years, but for now, I think their goal scoring problems will really cost them. Okay, now we move on to Switzerland versus Algeria. Vladimir Petkovic against his former team. Now it will be a very interesting match to see Gregor Kobel versus Riyad Mahrez. I think Algeria could cause some serious problems for Switzerland, but I'm still favoring Switzerland to advance with a 60 to 40% chance because Switzerland has much more World Cup experience and they have been much more convincing in the group stages. Sure, they tied with Qatar, but even that game they honestly dominated. And Qatar just got a little lucky twice. Of course, it wasn't just pure luck, they had their own moments too, but then Switzerland were better in that game. In games against Bosnia and Canada, Switzerland also got clear wins. On the other hand, Algeria, no offense to people who are from that country, but they have not been so convincing. They completely lost to Argentina, and sure, many people were expecting it, given that Argentina was the favorite, but many people were at least expecting Algeria to score one goal. And instead they just lost 3-0. And Algeria's defenders couldn't do anything with Messi, who was already 39 years old. Against Jordan they won, but Jordan even had the lead in that match for some time. And against Austria, they drew 3-3, but the first two times Austria took the lead. So I think Algeria could cause some problem, but I think Switzerland will eventually advance. I think it will end in a 3-1 or 2-1 victory for Switzerland. Okay, now let's go over to Brazil versus Japan. This will be one of the most interesting games of the round of 32. Japan has been one of the surprises of the whole group stages for me, because even without three of their key players, they showed some convincing results, absolutely demolishing Tunisia, tying with the Netherlands, and tying with Sweden, but they dominated that game and looked much better on stats. But at the same time, they got unlucky with their opponent. Sure, Brazil had some of their own shaky moments, such as in their first game against Morocco. But then in the next games, they won very convincingly. And their stars, such as Vinicius and even Matheus Cunha, have scored some good goals. So I'm just backing just by a little slight chance Brazil. I think it will be a 55 to 45% chance in favor of Brazil. But I do think that Japan will cause some problems for them. I predict to be just a narrow victory of 1-0 or 2-1 or hopefully 3-2, so that we could see more interesting games. Okay, now the United States versus Bosnia. In the first two games, the United States looked like an ideal team. But then in the third game, they lost to Turkey. Sure, it wasn't their strongest starting 11, because by that time they already guaranteed themselves first place, but some of the goals conceded still could have been not conceded. So that shows that the United States still has some things to work on. And I think if they were to face a team like Spain or France, as much as I want them to win, of course, as someone who lives there, I think they will lose that game. But for now, I think they could beat Bosnia, because Bosnia have not been so convincing. In the first game against Canada, they tied and Canada looked much better on paper. In the second game against Switzerland, they got completely destroyed 4-1. And in the third game against Qatar, they only barely won 3-1. So I think the United States will win that game, especially considering that they are playing at home. I think it will end in a 2-goal lead for the United States. Maybe 3-1 or 4-2 is what we are hopeful for, so that we could see many goals. But I think the United States will win that game. Okay, next, Germany versus Paraguay. Now, Paraguay was one of those teams who I underestimated. I predicted first place for them, but they actually ended up showing what they can do. In the first game, they lost to the United States, but then they figured out their game and won against Turkey 1-0 and then tied with Australia 0-0. However, I still think that Paraguay making it to the round of 32 was more luck in their game. No offense to anyone from that country, but I have to say the truth. Against Turkey, they got lucky that, as we say in Russian, у них был квадратный мяч, meaning that Turks had the ball in the form of a square. Of course, it's just a joke. But what it means is that Turks created many chances, but the ball just refused to get into the net. And I think the win against Turkey is not the work of the Paraguayan defenders more, as it is a lack of ability and a lack of confidence for the Turkish players, who are good most of the time, but in that match they ended up flopping. In the third game against Australia they tied, but at that time Australia didn't really need much, because they knew that a tie would be satisfying to them. So I think Paraguay making it out of the group stage was just luck for most of the time. And the teams that are facing Germany had some good games. They demolished Curacao 7-1, then they ended up beating Ivory Coast, and in the third game they lost to Ecuador, but it was at a time when they already knew they will be first place. Sure, Germany has their own problems. For example, against Ivory Coast, they were losing for most of the match. They lost against Ecuador, and even against Curacao, there was a time when Curacao had some good moments against them. However, if we compare those two teams, I think Germany is simply at the next level. So I think Paraguayans could be proud of what they have done, getting ahead of Turkey, who were considered the favorites by many, but I think Germany will definitely beat them. In fact, I think this will be one of the most one-sided games of the whole round of 32. I think it will end in a 4-1 victory for Germany or something like that. I don't see Paraguay advancing. Okay, next we have Netherlands versus Morocco. Now, I already told you my opinion about Morocco. I said that the scandal at the AFCON and the lack of experience of their manager will put massive pressure on them. And I'm not changing my opinion after the group stages. Sure, in the first game against Brazil, Morocco looked like the better side on paper, but then in the next two games, something clearly went wrong. Morocco barely defeated Scotland 1-0, and for some time it looked like Scotland could make it to a draw or maybe even a victory for them. Against Haiti, Haiti took the lead against them twice, and sure they ended up winning that game, but it wasn't in the most convincing way. If we compare that to the Netherlands, they had an absolutely fantastic of a group stage. Sure, it wasn't as fantastic as the teams that got 9 points, Mexico, Argentina and France, but it was still very convincing. Against Japan they tied, but they were in the lead twice and Japan only got lucky that Suzuki saved Mulin's goals. Otherwise they could have easily won that game. They absolutely demolished Sweden 5-1 with Isak and Gyökeres on the side, and they also beat Tunisia 3-1. So the Netherlands had a much more convincing group stage than Morocco. I do think that it could lead into an upset, but I think the chances of it are very unlikely. I'm backing for Netherlands to just nearly advance, maybe with a 3-2 victory or with a 2-1 victory. Morocco might cause some problems, but I think the Netherlands will advance. Okay, now we move on to Belgium versus Senegal. Now this is the first massive upset I'm going for in that video. On paper, Belgium was the more convincing side with 5 points compared to Senegal only 3, but let's not forget the groups they were put in. Belgium was put in a group where all of their opponents were very light compared to them. In fact, neither of their opponents have even made it out of the group stage before. I think so. Versus Senegal, we placed in a group of death where Kylian Mbappe and Erling Haaland were also placed, who are the top players of the whole generation. And even then, Senegal didn't give up. Against France, they only nearly lost 3-1, and in the first half, it even looked like they were playing equally. Against Norway, they just barely lost by 1 goal and scored a couple goals, and against Iraq, they absolutely demolished them. Versus Belgium have not been so convincing. Against Egypt, they tied, and only tied because Egypt scored an own goal. Otherwise, this could have easily been a win for Egypt. Against Iran, they tied, and sure, part of it was due to the heroism of the Iranian goalkeeper, but that still doesn't change the fact that Belgium could have done better. If this was the 2018 Belgium, they probably would have won that game. And even against New Zealand, they won, but a couple times New Zealand had some very dangerous moments. And it might have looked like New Zealand could have scored that goal. So I'm going for the first upset of that video. I'm predicting for Senegal to just nearly win the game. Maybe 2-1 or 1-0. Sure, I could be wrong, but this is one of the two matches that I'm going for an upset. Okay, now we go on to Spain versus Austria. Now, Spain had an absolutely good group stage. Once again, not as good as France, Mexico, and Argentina, but still good. In the first game, they tied against Cape Verde, but honestly, it was only due to Vazinia's heroism, and they could have won that game, and they create much more chances than Cape Verde. In the second game, they absolutely demolished Saudi Arabia, and in the third game, they beat Uruguay 1-0. I think Spain doesn't look as unbeatable as they were in the Euros, and they could lose to someone, but I don't think Austria will be that team. Austria didn't have so convincing tournament. Against Jordan, they only barely won, and for a couple of minutes, it even looked like Jordan might get their win. Against Argentina, they completely lost. And against Algeria, they looked convincing, but they didn't look like the clear favorite, and Algeria took the lead twice. So I think Spain will advance, maybe with a 2-1 or 3-1 victory. Okay, now we go on to France versus Sweden. Now, I already told you my opinion about France. About Sweden. With how they are playing, I don't think they will get much far. I already told you that the plan to use both Isaac and Gyökeres doesn't work against teams who are strong. It works against weaker teams like Tunisia, but against stronger teams like the Netherlands, it doesn't end up working the way Sweden's plan. And France is surely a strong team. I don't see how Sweden could beat them. And maybe hypothetically, but I think it's very unlikely. They lost to the Netherlands with a very convincing scoreline, and France on paper looks like an even better team than the Netherlands. I don't think they will lose to France like they did last time to the Netherlands, because that was just a group stage game and they knew they still had chances even if they lost that game. Versus against France, it will be a round of elimination game, so I think they will put up a good game, but at the end, France will still win it. I'm going for a 3-1 victory in favor of France. Okay, now we're going to Colombia versus Ghana. Now, Ghana has also been one of the surprises of that group stage, conceding only 2 goals from Croatia and beating Panama and tying with England, but the problem is that they also don't score much goals. Their main striker right now is Jordan Ayew, who is old by soccer standards, and it will be hard for him to score against top-level opponents. Antoine Semenyo have not shown the game that we expected from him so far, and hasn't scored a single goal. On the other hand, Colombia has been very convincing. They beat Uzbekistan and Democratic Republic of Congo, and sure, against Congo they struggled, but at the end a win is still a win. I know many people could say this is hypocrisy, because against Norway, whenever I'm predicting, I'll be saying different things, but I think that by the stats, Colombia looked very convincing in a game against Congo and could have scored more. When Norway didn't look so convincing in their games, but that will be something I'll talk about after. And in a game against Portugal, they completely did what they planned and got the tie which would give them a first place finish. I think it will be very hard for Ghana's defenders to stop Luis Diaz. So I'm going for Colombia victory. Maybe not convincing, but still a victory. Maybe 1-0 or 2-1 victory. Okay, now England versus Congo. Now, Congo has been one of the surprises of this tournament, and honestly they delivered Colombia even more problems than Portugal. And they also defeated Uzbekistan and tied with Portugal. On the other hand, England tied with another African team, Ghana, which makes me tempted to go for an upset here and say that the Democratic Republic of Congo will win the game. However, I still think that England is a better team on paper. Sure, they had some of their own moments, but in a game against Ghana, it was just a group stage game and they knew that even if they tied, they could still hold on. Versus now, it's a round of elimination, so I think they will be playing much more convincingly. I think Congo might score a goal there, but at the end, England will still win. I'm going for a 3-1 victory in favor of England. Okay, next, Argentina versus Cape Verde. Now, Cape Verde have been one of the surprises of the tournament. But the team they are facing, Argentina, has been even more convincing. They got 3 for 3 wins and conceded only one goal. So, if Cape Verde got on an easier opponent, maybe we could speak of an upset, but against Argentina, I just don't see that happening. The only way that I see how Cape Verde could hypothetically cause an upset is if they pull it off to a draw and then Vazinha shows heroism in the penalty shootouts like he did against Spain. But I don't think that will happen, unfortunately. Cape Verde can be proud of what they have achieved, but I think this will be the end of their fairy tale, at least for now. I am predicting for a win for Argentina with a score of maybe 3-1 or 4-2. Okay, now we'll move on to Norway versus Ivory Coast, the match that I will be attending in person. Now, here I'm gonna go for an upset and say Ivory Coast wins the game, regardless of the fact that many people are back in Norway. The reason why I think so is because Norway have not been so convincing in all of their 3 games. Against France, they absolutely lost 4-1, and sure we can say that Norway put up a reserve squad, but even then they still had some good players such as Oscar Bob and Antonio Nusa came from the bench. So I don't think that this was something that they could be proud of. Against Senegal, they only barely won, and even against Iraq, for a time the score was 1-1. Sure, at the end they came back, but that still shows something. On the other hand, Ivory Coast have been very convincing, to be honest. They beat Ecuador, sure with not the largest scoreline, but it still was a win, and Ivory Coast completely dominated that game. It's just that they struggled against Ecuador's defense. Then, against Germany, they were winning until Germany made some subs, and the sub Denis Undav came out to save the game. And against Curacao, they absolutely won. So something tells me that this will be the upset of the tournament. I'm predicting for Ivory Coast to win by a minimum score. Hopefully it will be a big score such as 3-2 and not a small score such as 1-0, because this will be the game that I will be going to. Okay, now we move on to South Africa versus Canada, the game that we will see today. Now, South Africa was another team that I underestimated. They ended up getting second place, but let's be honest, the way in which they did it wasn't the most convincing. First they lost to Mexico 2-0, and honestly it could have been 4-0 had Robbie Williams not made some admirable saves. Against Czechia they drew 1-1, but it was due to a penalty, and without a penalty they didn't really do much. Sure, they created some chances, but the Czechs deflected most of them. The only game where they truly looked convincing was the one against South Korea. On the other hand, Canada looked convincing in all 3 of their games. They absolutely demolished Qatar 6-0. They lost to Switzerland, but even then they had some good moments, and I think the loss was just due to the fact that Switzerland has more experience. And and they tied with Bosnia but looked like the better team of this game. So I think Canada is the clear favorite. I do think South Africa will make them struggle, but at the end I think Canada will just nearly get that 1-0 victory or 2-1. The only way that South Africa could win the game is if they pull it off to a draw and then Robin Williams does his job in the penalty shootouts. But I think Canada will not let that happen. I think they will just narrowly squeeze through a draw. Okay, now we are going to Australia versus Egypt. A game which will be taking place in Arlington. Now, Australia has shown some good results in the past. They defeated Turkey, and in the last World Cup game they only barely lost to Argentina, who were the future champions. But on the other hand, if we look at this group stage, Egypt has been more convincing than Australia. They haven't gotten a single loss when Australia got a loss to the United States. So most of Egypt's key players have more experience and play in better clubs than Australian players, higher rated clubs. Now there is speculation about Mohamed Salah being injured, which could be a blow for this Egyptian team. Right now I'm predicting my results thinking that Mohamed Salah will not be injured. But even if he is injured, I still think Egypt as a favorite. Maybe not with the same percentages as it would have been if Mo Salah wasn't injured, but still the favorites. Because even without Mohamed Salah, Egypt tied with Belgium. So I think that Egypt will win this game. Now the percentage by which I'm favoring Egypt could change depending on if Mo Salah will be available, but at the end, no matter what, I'm predicting that Egypt will win. I think if Mo Salah is not injured, it's a 70 to 30% chance. If Mo Salah is injured, it's a 52 to 48% chance. But I still think that Egypt will win. Okay, now the last game, Portugal versus Croatia. Honestly, one of the best games of the round of 32. Now, honestly, I'm really tempted to back Croatia in this one, because Portugal have not been so convincing. First they tied with DR Congo, then they beat Uzbekistan, but right after that they couldn't do anything against Colombia, and Cristiano Ronaldo, after saying the famous "I am back" line, didn't do anything against Colombia. So I think Portugal is not in the best shape right now, and if they were to win the World Cup, they must seriously change their strategy. I already told you my opinion that the plan to rely on Cristiano Ronaldo all the time is no longer working. However, the only problem with that is that Croatia have not had the most convincing group stage themselves. First they lost to England 4-2, and sure, they made the comeback in the first half after being down twice, but then in the second half, the age of the Croatian players is clearly playing against them, since many of them are already old and can't afford to run for the full 90 minutes, and they conceded 2 goals. Against Ghana and Panama, they only narrowly got the win, and against Panama, for a couple of times it looked like Panama might cause an upset. So I think neither of these teams have been convincing. I honestly don't even know who to back on this one. Because I could see how Croatia could win this game if they pull it to a draw, just like Colombia did in the group stage, and then it goes to penalty, and they win it on penalties, like they did it many times before against teams like Russia, Denmark, and Brazil. But I also think that with their experience and their players, such as Vitinha and João Neves, Portugal could beat Croatia. Sure, after they face Spain in the round of 16, I don't think they will win, to be honest. But right now, I think they could beat Croatia, so I'm just a little bit back in Portugal, just with a very, very small percentage, maybe 52 to 48. I do see how Croatia could win that game, but I think this will not happen because Portugal will just narrowly squeeze through. So there you have it, guys. Those are my predictions for the round of 32. Once again, I don't think all of them will be correct. So I'm not saying that you should use my predictions to go bad on soccer matches, but I'm hopeful that almost all of them will be correct, and that my and that and that my hypothesis will end up being true. There you have it, guys. If you like this video, give it a thumb up. If you dislike it, give it a thumb down. Subscribe and leave comments. Have a good day. Bye, guys.